Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Coffee and Open Source, a place for us to meet some new folks, learn about great tech, and have maybe a little fun along the way. So I have coffee today. I hope everybody else has coffee today. So today I'm really, really excited for my guest. My guest is Marie Antons. Marie, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Marie. I am the community engineer for a company called Harness, but my main focus is on their open source product called Drone. And Drone is a continuous integration product.
That's awesome. Like, I would love to get a little bit of more insight into that, right? I guess like one of the things that's very interesting to me about tech in general is like the community that gets built around tech. And I'd love to talk about it in a little bit. But first, I'd like to kind of get a better understanding of, you know, usually tech people or folks in tech like they have this origin story. Like, they came across a tech, maybe they were younger, maybe they were later in their career, maybe doing something else. And, they saw this opportunity, they saw tech and like, oh, this is great. I'm going to do this. Do you have a moment kind of in your life when that happened for you?
Yeah, so I got into tech kind of strangely. My husband and I lived in Bermuda for 4 years, and I used to be a chef. So I came from the culinary industry.
Oh, cool.
But as we moved to Bermuda, I had a small internship at this hotel resort. And then I couldn't really get back into culinary because Bermuda really puts their people first. And then a visa was not in the works at that time. So
Sure.
when we moved back, I was like, I should get back into culinary. So throughout my stay in Bermuda, I really specialized in Italian food. So I wanted to create like a pasta website to
Okay.
sell fresh pasta at the farmer's market. So it started kind of with like Googling, oh, I'm sure there's someone that can make a website for me. And then I saw the price of how much it cost to
Yeah.
build a website, and it was literally insane, from like logo making to website creation. I was like, wow, I'm not ready to put that kind of money into a website. So I am a very much do it yourself type of person. So it's like, I'm sure I could just do this by myself, like I am with almost everything. So I Googled like boot camps or how to create a website, and it came to the boot camp I went to, which was Delta V Code School. So my husband was like, I'm sure, not to be like a negative Nancy, but I'm sure you're like, I'm not sure if you're going to like it. So just start with the first two courses and then we'll see how it is from there. And then I basically fell in love with it from that moment on. We started with Khan Academy,
Okay.
and I was not really interested in their like generic like themes of like, I was in the JavaScript course and there was this fish tank exercise. So I was
Okay.
like, I don't really want to build a fish tank. So I built like a Mario scene, since it was dealing with like for loops and animation. So I built out the entire like bullet scene where the bullet was shooting from the cannon and Mario was jumping to get that coin.
Yeah.
So I just tried to make it as fun as possible, and it basically just got me hooked from there. So then I continued with the entire boot camp experience, which was very hard, but worth it.
That's awesome. I mean, there's like I want to talk to people who got started in code camps. The experience is always very mixed. Like some people love it, like absolutely love the classes they took, love the instructors, and there's other people that were a bit less jazzed about it. It sounds to me you're a bit. I think you understood that it was something that you're really interested in, but maybe you didn't subscribe as much to like maybe the practicum or the curriculum or whatever you want to call it. But I think what's really interesting about that is that you powered through it and you're like, this is what I want to do. So I'm going to just figure it out and use like some of the resources they gave me to figure out what I want to do and be successful. Um,
Yep.
so So was it very much like it was a JavaScript focused code camp?
Yeah, so part of it was JavaScript.
Okay.
We started with basic HTML and CSS, then we went to JavaScript, and then we ended in C# and React.
Okay.
So basically, I took it as I'm just going to try to have fun with it. And I was super. So if you would have tried to do this interview with me when I started boot camp, I would have been like so closed off and shy because I would have said previously I was extremely introverted,
Sure.
but something just clicked throughout boot camp where I was like, if I'm making this career change, I have to be as active and out there as possible, or I'm just going to be disconnected and feel like kind of strange. And it's really what I make of my own career. So I'm like, well, I can only get what I ask for. So I'm going to be try to be as active as possible, asking questions, being like kind of out there. I got the nickname of Den Mother in boot camp because I was like the one like we should meet at 7 p.m. and do our data structures and talk through it, and everyone needs to be connected and kind of like building that collaborative space. I found was super helpful through like just being engaged with boot camp and wanting to like kind of keep your morale up, because once you're stuck trying to figure things out, and programming is hard. So the more people you can kind of be connected with, the better is what I thought, and which what helped for me too.
It's funny that you mentioned that it's hard, right? Like I am very much on this soapbox of like people who get into tech, like they have to be a little bit of a masochist. Like they kind of have to enjoy the pain because the pain is a majority of the job, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And one thing that's interesting was that kind of was that I guess mindset kind provided to you or the other folks that went when you were going through the boot camp, or was it very much like this is a great opportunity for you to make money and all this sort of stuff, or was it very much like you have to like this sort of work in order to be successful?
We started off with kind of the main guy, his name's Aaron. He kind of talked about having a growth mindset and how that is absolutely necessary in this field of work, because how many times have you been so frustrated at like a bug or like something doesn't work, or it works on my machine but not someone else's machine, and all the frustration that comes with it?
Yep.
It's like, well, yeah, it's going to happen, and just have to be okay with it. That's like most things. It's kind of hard to move on if you're stuck in the like, oh, it's just hard and I don't know what to do.
Yeah. No,
But
I sorry, go ahead.
also that's why trying to be engaged with your fellow boot camp members as well will really help, because it also kind of brings to light, while you might do something one way, I might do something another way, Kirk might do something another way, Meg might do something another way. It's all okay because it probably works the same, and you're figuring out, oh, it's not a one size fits all either. So having that growth mindset as well is like, well, it could be done a million different ways, and my way is just one way.
Yeah, I think that there's something to that, right? Where I think, and this is maybe just from my experience working in tech, like the networking and the community building is what's really impactful, right? I
Yes.
mean, honestly, in most cases, the job is very boring, right? And there's a lot of failure in the job. You know,
Yeah.
I know there's companies out there that are doing really interesting things, but for the most part, there's a lot of just okay, here's some data. You know, it's in a database or some data store, and I need you to write an app that basically interacts with that data. And that is literally the job for I don't know what the numbers are, but probably like 90% of work, right?
Yeah.
So you don't get a lot of opportunities to do like really like interesting work. It might be interesting based on the business domain, but like it's the people that you work with, it's the people that you meet along the way that kind of keep you interested in doing the work. And I think one thing that's very, very interesting about code camps in general is that they kind of just put everybody into kind of like a fishbowl and they say, okay, some of you might love this, some of you might hate this, but like this is an opportunity for you to like your first step in like learning how to network and learning how to kind of build community, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and collaborate. What was I gonna say? It's it's boot camp is really what you make it. Some I've talked to some members who are also in boot camp who are quite shy about kind of collaborating with bootcamp members, and that also makes for like such a lonely experience, and hopefully not what their job will be in the future, because our jobs are very much about talking with people, collaborating with people, pair programming with people, so we can't really do anything alone.
Yeah, I mean, that's true too. Like a lot of the function of a person in tech, it's like singular. Like I have some work items that I need to work against. I have some tasks. I have some bugs to fix. And
Mhm.
that's, that downplays like the amount of like networking internally that you have to do. Like, and unless you work for a small company and you're literally, the front end designer, you work on the back end, you write the SQL scripts, you manage the web server and whatever web technology you use.
Mhm.
That happens, but for the most part, you're gonna have to interface with at least one or two other people.
Yeah.
Worst case, you interface with like a manager, right? And they just like, these are all the work. This is all the work that you have to do, and you're like, oh, okay, that's a lot, and it's just me, so okay.
Yeah.
Um, I think one of the things too that's really interesting. Did you growing up, like obviously, yeah, I imagine you want to be in the culinary space, and that's why you got into that field originally. Now that you're in tech, do you see some kind of similarities between like maybe not the work obviously because the work is substantially different, but like the way you have to think about things? Obviously, in tech is very recipe oriented in my opinion. Like there's canonical things you drop in. Like do you see some cross sections of being in the culinary world and being in the tech world?
Yeah, I think for most careers there's a lot of crossover, which some people almost disqualify themselves when they're trying to get into tech from career changing. They're like, oh,
Yeah.
I was a nurse, or I was a in virtual coffee. I meet a lot of people who have different backgrounds, and one was a chemist, and I was like, wow, that is amazing. But even with like culinary, it's all the time management, being organized, problem shooting, like troubleshooting, problem solving. um, because think if you run out of an ingredient and you have to make a
Yeah.
swap on the fly, or if you run out of a dish completely, how do you kind of explain like, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have a
Yeah.
sample today?
Yeah. Yeah. Like I always, and this is just me being just an entitled person. Whenever
Mhm.
I go to a place and I'm like, "What do you mean that thing on the menu's crossed out?" Like, people probably want it. I understand like how logistics work and how demand works and like you just can't make 1,000 salmon dishes because if you only sell 900 of them, you lose a lot of salmon dishes, right? I get all of that.
Yep.
But at the same time, I'm like, "What do you mean you don't have the fish today?" Like, what do you mean? Especially like if you go to like a breakfast place and like you know, we don't have bacon today.
Or
Or it's like,
eggs.
what do you mean you don't have bacon? You're a breakfast place. Like, figure it out. Like, I'll go down to the store and if you make me the bacon, I'll buy it for you. I
Yeah.
mean, it's very interesting. So, was is how long ago did you graduate from Code Camp? If you did graduate, I'm sorry if you didn't
Yeah.
graduate or not, but
Yeah, I did.
yeah,
So
okay, congrats.
thanks. For my boot camp, we had to do a whiteboarding assessment, which
Okay.
it took me 3 times to pass.
Oh wow.
Each time it was a different question, but um, we did data structures and algorithms throughout our boot camp,
Mm-hmm.
but no one really imagined the end of graduation where you're like, oh, I actually have to pass one of these now. And it was
Yeah.
timed. So it was a timed live in person whiteboarding. So I did that about a year and a half ago.
Okay.
So I just passed my year of professional development in July. So it's only been just over a year.
Okay. I mean, so you're pretty fresh in tech.
Yep.
And this is going to be a very pointed question because I have an opinion on this. How
Yeah.
did you enjoy the whiteboard interview process?
I
Be
do
honest.
I do see its purpose. However,
Okay.
I would prefer it to be a bit more collaborative. So
Mm-hmm.
through so I had my first job and then I quit for 2 months and then I got my job at Harness. Throughout
Okay.
those 2 months, I had many whiteboarding or paired programming exercises. And it
Okay.
ranged from someone staring at you, watching you do the work with no comments, to someone helping, like, oh, I see that you're writing this, but do you remember that JavaScript doesn't actually have like a dictionary? And I'm just like, no. Or
Oh. Okay.
like whatever I
Interesting.
was whatever I was saying. Um, so they kind of like nudged you in the right direction instead of just watching you
Yeah.
fail and
Just
flail.
flail, yeah.
Yeah. So I do
Yeah.
see the purpose, but I would prefer most whiteboards to be more on the collaborative side because the point of the whiteboarding exercise is to see if they want to work with you. And if they're not working with
Mm,
you, then what is the point? Like
interesting.
we all fail daily, like
Yeah.
trying things. So seeing someone fail on a whiteboarding test, which they can't use Google or can't use
Yep.
any outside help, I don't know how that's a surprise for anyone.
Yeah, I mean, my whole opinion of the whiteboard interview is that it is something that existed before like all of the resources that were available online for people to be more effective in their job. And it's just kind of a legacy thing. I've
Yeah.
never had to write a bubble sort in my
Yep.
entire professional career. I've
Yeah.
never had to like reverse a string in my entire professional career.
Yep.
I think
Builds
the
it.
yeah, exactly, right? Like there's frameworks that exist that obfuscate a lot of these very common algorithms and they make your life substantially easier. I think
Mhm.
one of the things that's very interesting about whiteboard interviews, and I think you touched on it, you made a comment about if they want to work with you or not. And I think my personal opinion is a whiteboard interview does not tell you anything about a person other than how easily or how good their memory is,
Yep.
right? Because I mean, I don't know if you looked into this, but there's all sorts of resources out there that exist literally to pass like whiteboard interviews, right? There's
Yeah.
things like Lead Code, or there's books that have been written how to pass the Google interview, right?
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that's very interesting about all of that is that there's no like direct connection between the interview process in that case and like the work that you actually do.
Yeah.
Like I've seen a lot of companies go down this route now, like they kind of give you like a faux project. And they don't expect you to like write a bunch of code and do a bunch of free work, but like they want to know how you think like working through problems that come about when you're working on a project. And I think that approach is substantially better. Um, yeah.
I guess it depends on how they go about that as well, because I've done some take home projects that were very explicit for customers. So it was
Sure.
also almost like I signed an NDA and did some free work, which I definitely don't like because
Yeah.
I felt very taken advantage of because it took me 2 weeks to make this like, and I obviously you can't really be a perfectionist in tech because
Yeah.
everything goes wrong all the time. But in terms of this side project that he wanted me to do, I wanted to make it pixel perfect because I got one of those Adobe prototypes. So it
Okay.
had all the dimensions and everything on it. So it took me so long to just like make everything exactly like the prototype.
Yeah.
And then I turned it in and was rejected. So it was just like,
Yeah.
oh man, like I spent so much time on this when all of my friends were like, you shouldn't spend that much time on a take home. But
Yeah.
the guy was literally like, take your time, get it into us when you're done.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think that, and obviously this is coming from a place of I haven't ever had to like getting I got into tech like a long time ago and I stayed in tech. So like I don't there's not like this perception that like oh you're a career changer or whatever. So I have like I'm from a place of privilege in that point. But I think one thing that's very interesting is like they give you an assignment and they say okay you have 2 weeks. In my head immediately as a tech person I'm like so your interview process is long then, because you have like 4 or 5 candidates probably, and you're giving each of them like a 2 week homework assignment. So that means your interview process is slower than a lot of other companies, which to me is a red flag.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
if your interview process, from initial contact to recruiter to eventually, if you do fortunate enough to get an offer, it shouldn't be longer than like a month or a month and a half,
Yeah. Or
right?
even quicker than that. My
Yeah,
interview process at Harness was less than a week.
yeah. I mean, and obviously, the smaller the company, the more flexibility they have, and I think that's great
Yeah.
because nobody enjoys the interview process. Coming from somebody who,
Not
yeah,
waiting throughout all of the so I create a spreadsheet on Notion to kind of track all of my points of contact.
yep,
And once you get I was interviewing on average 5 times a week. So keeping track of all these interviews, like, oh, I talked to
yeah,
Isaac on Monday about XYZ, and then I meet with his boss like in 3 days. And
Yep.
so I'll mention stuff we already talked about and like trying to stay organized and remember like, oh, I should follow up sometime. I haven't heard
Yeah.
back from them. So especially interviews that are so drawn out, it becomes really hard to manage.
Yeah. I mean, and as somebody who's interviewed plenty of people in my career, the process, if it's long, it just makes you a bit less interested in the process.
Yeah.
And um, eventually, if you do get to a point where you're interviewing people, I don't know if you're interviewing people right now, but like most companies, they give you like a spreadsheet of like, these are the questions you want to ask, grade their answers on a scale from whatever, right? Or some form of that.
Mm-hmm.
And my immediate response is always like, well, what, like, why do we need this? Like, why do we need to grade people? And I understand that you have to like stack candidates on top of each other, but I mean, I would very much rather work with somebody who is not very strong technically, but they just seem like a good person to work with. Like, and
Yeah.
they were interested. And I can tell if you're hungry and you want to actually like learn the stuff and you're interested about the company, like that goes light years beyond, in my opinion, than like, oh, I'm strong technically. I have like this experience at this company and this experience at this company. So all my like my boss probably doesn't like my feedback for interviews because it's like this person is very strong technically, don't hire them.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that, like this person will need a longer ramp up, but I really enjoyed their conversation and I was actually kind of sad when the interview was over, so we should look into moving them along.
Yeah.
um
And then
and I
just
think,
like
yeah.
culture fit, like
Yeah.
having someone you could collaborate with and just get along with on a daily basis instead of someone being super smart technically and then not being able to collaborate or discuss anything because they're so like in their box. I think that is why I got offered a job at Harness because I didn't know any of their tech stack. I don't know anything about
Sure.
CICD. So they're like, let's get you ramped up. I'm good at talking with community, being
Hmm.
interactive with the community, putting myself out there, obviously.
Yeah.
So that's not an issue. And I don't mind being vulnerable and being like, I have no idea what I'm talking about. Let's just what can I do to ramp up on this?
Yeah, I think, well, modesty is very important too. Like you mentioned, like, willingness to get out there. I think that's really important. But also like feeling comfortable enough to like put yourself in situations where you might not know the answer to everything. Like
Yeah.
that's really important to me. Like I try very, very hard to always ask questions or put myself in situations where I don't know the answer. I just want to get a better understanding of what the answer is. And maybe
Yeah.
the question is being asked the wrong way, because that's how you really solve problems.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and obviously, I work in marketing. I used to be a developer. I work in marketing now. But I think the thing that translates is that the answers are different depending on like who you are in an organization.
Yeah.
Like the same question gets answered depending on who you ask, and I think that's what's really important, is like that different um, opinion on how, like, what's really important,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think for somebody who works in the community, like your number one answer is like, okay, well, how does it like this is this because it positively affects the community, or this is this because it negatively affects the community. Because at the end of the day, like Harness pays you to like integrate yourself with the developer community or the Harness community and learn and build upon that. Like that's great, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I love doing it. The probably the biggest trouble with building a community is kind of getting the answer. Like, what do they actually want?
Yeah.
Sometimes we get those like very generic questions like, oh, why is the sky blue? Why is the sky blue? And you're just like,
Yeah.
can you give me more detail? Can you give me any
Yeah.
more detail? Like,
That's not going to get any better. I'm sorry to tell you. That's not going
I
to get any
know,
better.
I know.
Like the more experience you get, the more ambiguous the questions are and the more opaque the answers are. And that's just how life is, sadly.
Yeah, I feel
There's
like I have to like go gold digging every time. Like, so
yeah,
what are we looking at here?
the amount of times that I say it depends or your mileage may vary like a day is way, way too high, and that's kind of sad.
Yeah.
One thing that I think was interesting too is you were kind of talking about, your transition into tech and, the opportunity that you have at Harness, is that you mentioned like DevOps or CI/CD, right? And
Mhm.
obviously, I imagine this is something that was very glossed over, if referenced at all, during your code camp, right? Like
Yeah.
what what was your experience like being introduced to that concept? Because I think the concept is very novel. Like I'm a
Mhm.
big proponent of these things if people follow my stuff, but I think like the concept is fairly new. Like if you think about it in tech history, right? Like
Yeah.
what was your initial thoughts like as you were looking more into CI/CD, continuous delivery, continuous integration, and DevOps in general? Like, were you like, "Oh, this is the greatest thing ever," or
Mhm.
this adds like way more work to me as a developer?
So we did some work in boot camp, kind of with the concept of CI/CD and like
Sure.
pipeline setup, but it was very like this is an introductory topic.
Yeah.
Like we're just literally barely scratching, not even the surface. We're like in the atmosphere, like we're just passing by. But I thought it made complete sense. But it's also very hard as a new person to break down your coding into chunks. You just want to do the complete feature or complete app all in one like giant commit. It's hard to like break things down into chunks. So whenever you pushed code and pushing code, like we're all familiar, or most people are familiar with like GitHub Actions.
Sure. Yeah.
And that was my first introduction to it because one of our projects we had to set up GitHub Actions. And then we just look at the screen like, what is all this red? Why is it red?
Oh no.
So it's like a very foreign topic for me.
Yeah.
It still is because there's so many moving parts. It's I'll probably take a year and a half to like fully
Yeah.
grasp everything. So yeah, it's still very very much foreign, but yeah, I think it's a great concept.
Yeah, I think it's too like the whole idea, and you mentioned like immediately a tool, and I think that's very very interesting because whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, I think a lot of people like immediately they take the phrase and they say okay, connect it to a tool, whether that be you mentioned GitHub Actions or GitLab or Azure DevOps or like pick your
Yeah, or
you know
harness.
yeah, or Harness, right? I'm so
Yeah,
sorry. Or Harness,
that's
number
fine.
one, Harness.io. And I think but one of but I guess my point is that people immediately like go into tools. And when I used to have these conversations with customers about DevOps, when I was doing that, it was like, no, 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 don't worry about the tool. The tool will just figure itself out. Like
Yeah,
obviously, some tools are way better than others in particular use cases. That's why there's so many of them out there.
yeah,
But it's very much like you need to be ready to make a cultural change in your organization because
yeah,
your developers are probably going to have more work, your ops people are going to have more work, but it doesn't mean that it's bad work. It's work to save themselves in the future. It's very much like insurance, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
you invest in this particular thing, so in the future you don't have like your site down for like half a day because you're trying to
yeah,
figure something out.
yeah.
Um, but that's what's interesting. And I think, when you were going through the interview process at Harness, was it very much, you mentioned that you didn't have like a background or you didn't really have a lot of knowledge in their stack. Like,
Yeah.
what was it about their stack that really interested you?
So when I first saw the job posting, it was
Hmm.
all about community and building the
Yeah.
community and being involved in open source, which is I think is extremely valuable. I got into open source from Virtual Coffee. My bootcamp instructor is also a big open source advocate. His name's Keith. But that is what really drove me to apply for the position because I was like,
Yeah.
community, yeah, that's like up my alley.
Yeah.
Oh, open source, yeah, I totally want to be in open source. So I was like, this is a perfect fit. And I think I mentioned to Becca, who's the founder of Virtual Coffee, I was like, I think this job is a good fit. And it's just like, yeah, this is totally a good fit because I was like kind of looking for maybe DevRel, maybe continuing with development, but this basically I like looked at my resume, looked at the job application, and I was like, huh, this seems like a perfect fit. Like I don't know of any other job I applied for that was like such a good fit.
Yeah. There's definitely something to say about like you fall in love with just like you mentioned things that are very very resonating for me, like open source, right? Like the ability open source community to me is like the reason why I'm in tech now. It might not have been the reason why I got into tech, but I think it's the reason why I'm in tech now. And I think there's a lot of folks out there that see all of the great conversations that are being had. So I just want to be a part of those conversations. And it seems to me like you picked that up pretty quickly, which I think is awesome. I think as well, and I don't know how big Harness is, but I'd imagine they're a smaller size company, right? So
We just surpassed 400 employees.
yeah, yeah.
So
So
we're like pretty rapidly.
yeah, and I think one of the things that's really interesting about that is that it's a small-ish company who has leaned into like modern tech and tried to figure out new ways to engage with their audience, which I think is really interesting. Um, a lot of companies, regardless of their size, like they'll have like customer engineers or customer advocates or developer advocates, or whatever you want to call them, but it's very, and I want to be very careful because I have lots of friends in developer advocacy and I don't want to irritate them. But I
Yeah.
think it's very much like company messaging out
Yeah.
instead of community feedback in. And I
Yeah.
think that's what's really, really important to call out is like true community is a two-way conversation, right? And I think one of the things that, I'd like to get understanding from you is like, what is it about the community that excites you so much? Like, obviously, you went through this process, you saw this job, and you're like, oh, that sounds like fun. And especially somebody who's new in tech, like, I'll be completely free. Like, tech communities can be very toxic,
Yeah,
right?
it's actually kind of
Yeah,
intimidating. It's very
yeah,
intimidating. So we kind of, when I got into the position, it was a very open-ended, it still is a very open-ended position. I'm literally just figuring out what works, failing, doing better, like finding out all the processes that I actually need to have in place. And I am literally in charge of making sure our community is not a toxic community.
well, that's amazing.
Yeah, so making sure people are getting help, which is also extremely hard to do. It's hard when you're getting like 15 questions a day, and then most of them are extremely complex. So it's just finding the right balance of like, yeah, let me help you. Let's hop on a Zoom. Let's figure this out together. Or do I need to point you into a different direction? Or do our docs need updated? Trying to make everything inclusive as well is also not easy because we need to think of everybody.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, it's quite intimidating. I'm not building a community from scratch. We're just nurturing the community that
Sure.
was previously, because Drone was acquired, I think, a year ago. Um, so they haven't really had anyone community focused because they were led by Brad. He was the sole developer behind Drone. So one person can't do everything. So he's had his hands quite full. And it's quite amazing to see how many people are backing this
Yeah.
CI product. And I learned every day from people I meet with. Like I met with someone from South Africa who was just like so hyped, and hearing people so happy about a product is really kind of what drives me.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think, one of the things that I find very captivating about the community is that there's all these different levels of passion and interest as well as knowledge. And I think you getting the right people in the right places, and it's only going to benefit you.
Yeah.
And we do have a question on the chat. So Meg underscore Gutshaw. Hopefully, I didn't mispronounce your name. Their question is, who has been your biggest help in starting this new position at Harness?
I would say probably our senior engineer TP, and also the founder Brad, also my manager Luke. Luke is very much like, let's just try it out and figure it out. I know it's like super hard to start with such an open-ended position, but my company is very much about like failing and then moving on and learning.
Yeah,
Also TP, it's it's very, coming from my last position, which was a very super small startup that wasn't like that awesome to work for. Coming into Harness and having compassionate coworkers who are
yeah,
like, I can actually tell that you're getting burnt out. You should probably take a day off.
yeah.
Is
That's
such
great.
a, like, we very much underestimate rest, because I'm sure you've been there where you're learning all these new things. I'm learning like an entire new ecosystem, CICD, how to engage with community, how to like analyze everything in community health. It's a lot to take in all at once. So I was like, let me do everything. And having someone's like, oh, slow down, let's focus on this and this. So yeah, the entire drone team is pretty amazing. Um, Harness as a whole is pretty amazing. I know I'm like harping so hard on them, but
No,
they're
no.
so awesome.
There's nothing wrong with being proud about where you work. I mean,
Yeah.
we were talking a little bit before the stream started. Like, I just started at a new company. I've
Mhm.
been there for about 2 months. This is beginning of November 2021 for people that are in the future. And I didn't have any domain knowledge either. Like, when I went for the interview process, I think what really resonates a lot when people are hiring is they want new perspective,
Yeah.
especially when you're at that state like you're talking about where there's just this rapid growth and you need to figure out different ways to tell your story. And I think getting different people's opinion is really, really valuable. Because if you were to hire somebody, I'm not saying that, hiring from inside the ecosystem is bad, but I'm saying if you hire somebody who is like a tried and true, like they've been working with Harness since the inception, they know all things in and out, like that's great to get people that are in the community that are really excited about that. But bringing them in, you're not going to learn anything new from them more than likely,
Yeah.
right? That person is probably better to be in the community, collaborating with the community, and providing like great feedback back to you.
Yeah.
That's my personal opinion. I'm not saying that you should never hire experts
Mhm.
because that sounds like a terrible business idea. But I think one of the things that's very interesting about hiring, especially when you're growing, is you want people that have different points of view, and so they can put some pressure on some more legacy ways of thought, which might be great, but also might not be great, right? And you want to be able to accommodate.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so true. Um, yeah. I think
No, I mean,
I'm just thinking about like the
yeah,
diversity aspect, and just bringing new insight into community and what community actually needs. And most companies have their documentation pretty set, and just rereading it. And I know the first week I was having trouble with the documentation. I went to my virtual coffee friends and was
yeah,
like, obviously, let me show you how I'm installing. I'm obviously missing a step.
sure,
And we could not figure it out. So obviously docs needed updated. We
yep.
needed to like redo everything, because if I'm missing it, everyone else is missing it, then just redoing it is just probably best.
Yeah, I think that's probably the number one most valuable feedback item that you can get from a new hire. Hey, here are our docs, here are our online marketing assets, here's our getting started. Just go through it and tell me if it works for you or not. And what a lot of people will find out, and I found this out at the company I currently work with, and I've dealt with this at other companies I work with too, where there's a lot of assumed knowledge, and
Yes.
assumed knowledge is not good, right? You
Yeah.
never want to assume that things are easy, because honestly, for different people, things are different ways, different levels of difficult. And you don't want to make a bunch of assumptions about what people already know. Because at the end
Yeah.
of the day, if someone's new to your product, that's a great opportunity for you, because you're getting a
Yep.
new potentially new customer. Assuming that person knows the ins and outs of your product is not a good look. And I
Yeah.
think the fact that you called out a couple of things like, oh, the docs, I was having some trouble with the docs, or the getting started, or
Mhm.
the onboarding process for anything. Like those are like the most valuable assets that a tech company that builds products has, right? So not having those laid out like the most seamless way, the least frictionless, I guess the the way with the least amount of friction is really, really important. Because at the end of the
Yeah.
day, it's not about exciting current customers. That's important too, but it's all about getting new customers, and that's how you grow.
And retaining customers as well,
Yeah,
building all the relationships and making sure everyone's set. The path of least resistance.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's something too, like, because at least in tech, like I was mentioning a bit earlier, that a lot of the problems from a tech perspective are pretty straightforward, like forms over data. Is when you start to get really is when things start to get really interesting, is when you start to add, like I said, that domain knowledge on top of it, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do I incorporate like really, really good CICD into this process? Or how do I try to leverage this new technology that might make our developers' lives easier, right? Maybe a tool or maybe a framework or something, right? And I kind of like get some thoughts from you as somebody who is, I guess fairly new. I apologize for saying fairly new, but like, what are some of the tools that you've came across that you're like, oh wow, like this is great, like this is gonna make my life easier.
I actually don't use too many tools. I would say my
Yeah,
community for sure,
yeah,
virtual coffee, because any question I could ever have, regardless how silly it seems, all I have to do is like post in the help and pairing channel or reach out to like a close friend. And then it's like, oh yeah, let's hop on. Or one of our members, his name is Ray, he puts on this like content creation meeting every week. And that's just like exploring all the new ways that we could create content, what we're doing with content, Twitch being one of them. We've discussed Twitch a bit. I know a lot of our members also do Twitch. And I guess that tool and kind of like how do we harness different social platforms to get the
sure.
word out as well, which I haven't explored much into because I only have so much time in the day.
Yeah, of course.
Um, but eventually when I get there, I'll probably use like Twitch and all of those different like streaming platforms. I'll probably start with Twitter Spaces since that's
Yeah,
very like low key. You don't have to set up a lot. You don't need any like not really much of anything. You just open it and then
yeah.
there you are. People come or they don't.
So one thing that I thought was really great right there is I asked a very ambiguous question, like what tools, and you immediately went to tools that empower the community,
Yeah.
right? Like if I was asking somebody else, they might say, "Oh, like VS Code is great," or like GitHub Actions is great, or like whatever, like some like technical tool, and you immediately
Yeah.
went tools that you use to strengthen your relationship with the community. Like good, bad, or indifferent, like Twitter is great, right?
Yeah.
Like it gives you the opportunity to interface with people that you would never have the opportunity to interface with. Like for
Mhm.
instance, like I met you because I was like, I'm looking for people to interview on my coffee and open source show, and you're like, I would love to do that. I'm like,
Yeah.
perfect. I,
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't even look into your background. I didn't screen you. I was like, this
Yeah.
person is excited about open source. That's the only
Yep.
reason why they would want to take part in this silly interview. So let's do it. And I think
Yes.
that's what really resonates for me. And things like Twitch and different live streaming platforms is really helpful too. I think one thing that's also very interesting is like there is all sorts of these like platforms that are being created now for new and effective ways to like connect each other, right?
Yep.
There are known social media platforms that I think for the most part people might have a distaste for because of a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
But then you see things like TikTok, which in my opinion is like literally just like a happy drip into my veins like
Yeah.
whenever I watch TikTok, right? And
That's
like
what I really
it only gets better like as the algorithm learns more and more about you, like the content gets more and more for you, and you're like, I can watch this for like an hour and lose time.
yeah.
You mentioned things like Twitter Spaces. Streaming is really interesting to me. Obviously this is a stream that gets disseminated, but uh, at the end of the day it's really really interesting how people now, because of we live in a time where people are being forced to work from home or forced to work in a more virtual environment,
Mm-hmm.
like all of these platforms that enable like seeing face to face and interacting in a virtual way have like skyrocketed, right? Which I think is great. And
I
like,
think people also
yeah,
want to feel like connected as well. So that's why there's like growing popularity in all of these, like Twitch, the streaming, the TikToks. Everyone
yeah,
just wants to feel like really connected with one another, especially
yeah,
during like quarantine times.
yeah. I mean, it's one of those things too where and my wife makes fun of me this all the time. I have like way more Twitter friends than like actual friends, like people
Mm-hmm.
that I have conversations with on Twitter. And like she's like, why don't you like message so and so, like my best friend who lives like 10 minutes away. I'm
Yeah.
like, nah, he's there. Like I can talk to him whenever I want. But like these people online, they're only available for like 2 or 3 hours a day, so I have to talk to them.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's great. It also times it probably could be unhealthy because I think everybody can admit they probably look at their phone a bit too much. But I
Mm-hmm.
think one thing that's very interesting about like Twitter friends is that when you meet them in person, it's like the greatest thing ever. Like I recently had the opportunity to meet like Twitter friends like in real life, and I was like, this is amazing. Like people walk up to me, it's like, yeah. I'm like, okay. this is weird because I see like your entire body. Oh, you're way taller than I thought. Like I remember I met one of my good friends and like she was sitting down and I walked up and she stood up and she was taller than me. I'm not very tall, but it doesn't matter. I'm like, you're way taller than I expected. And that was like a great like extra little piece of information.
Yeah.
And Meg comments, online friends are real friends. I totally agree. I think there's like it's funny like there's IRL friends, but like at the end of the day, like
They're
and
all
I
real
mean
life friends.
I mean Marie, like the only difference between us like not meeting like and being friends is like the fact that we've been like I haven't actually seen you physically in person. I've seen you in virtually in person now. So like I mean, what's the difference, right? I think that's what's really cool too is also like I'm never gonna have the opportunity to meet people like in South Africa or meet people in parts of Asia or in Europe. Like, yeah, maybe I can meet them at some point, but I can't talk to them every day, like in person.
Yeah, there's a new connectivity we're experiencing. Meg is also in virtual coffee. So
Good.
I haven't technically met her yet, but we've been friends for over a year now. I, everyone in virtual coffee is always like, Marie's like a Pokemon catcher because I always travel to cities I know virtual coffee
Yeah.
people are in.
Oh,
So
cool.
I'll like travel to Kansas City, or when I went to All Things Open, I met two of my virtual coffee friends. And so like there's a joke that I'm like a Pokemon catcher and I gotta catch them all. So
No, I mean, there's something to that. If you're given the opportunity, I mean, and you enjoy the work, like traveling is great because you get the opportunity to meet all sorts of different people.
yeah.
I think where it becomes challenging, and I'd like to kind of talk to you about this for a little bit too, since it seems like you do a little bit of travel. Obviously, in the COVID times, it's harder, but
Mhm.
like the biggest hang up that I had with business travel is like it's a lot of like you're in a hotel and then maybe you're at an event and then maybe you have some dinner and then you're back at the hotel. And like there's not like it seems to me like it's just a very repetitive process. So
Yeah.
like from your experience, like how do you kind of break that mold and like actually enjoy business travel?
I try to talk to a lot of people or know
Sure.
someone that's going as well so we can go like have dinner together, go get drinks together. Sometimes like either like share like a boarding together, like a hotel or something, and like just kind of do that.
Yeah.
But I do try to know someone everywhere I'm going and make sure I'm as interactive as possible. That can also be quite draining. When I went to All Things Open, I was quite active, but I also felt so drained at night. So trying to balance
Yeah.
like off time versus social time, which I think that comes from being like pretty introverted, where I'm
Sure.
like mentally drained from being like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
I'm so excited about meeting everyone. And then
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm really tired. But yeah, trying to balance like actually being engaged with other people. I think that's super important for business travel. Otherwise it kind of feels lonely
Sure.
because you're
Yeah.
just traveling, you're on an airplane, you're doing an Uber, then you're in your hotel, and then you go to the conference event or whatever event you're going to, and then you just go back to your hotel room.
Yeah.
But trying to stay as engaged with people and meeting new people. I usually, at the All Things Open conference, I try to talk to each one of the speakers afterwards just to
Oh,
kind of
cool.
like thank them and then make sure like I could say what I liked about their
Hmm.
talk. Um, and kind of be engaged that way and try to make as many friends because
Yeah.
like I kind of mentioned in the beginning, I basically was committed to putting myself out there and
Yeah.
making these new connections to feel as involved because I feel like the tech community has been so welcoming and people are super easy to talk to. They just want to like collab on things and I haven't met really anyone unfriendly. So I
That's
think that
great.
speaks
I
volumes.
mean, I don't want to burst your happy bubble, but
Yeah,
that's
I
not the
know
norm at all, right?
Twitter
And,
probably
and
makes it seem so.
sure, and I've been doing public speaking and going to events for a while, and I think your statement is pretty spot on. Like
Mhm.
the people that go to events, like they go to events for a particular reason, right?
Yep.
Like their company is paying their way for them to network, learn about tech, and maybe I don't know something else, whatever. But I
Yeah.
think if you're really introverted or if you make a name for yourself as being somebody who's not really cool to hang out with, like no one will hang out with you.
Yeah.
And I think like I've heard I've heard stories from my friends that are just like, yeah, I was talking to this person after one of my sessions, and it was just not a great experience, right? Like
Oh
that
yeah.
still exists, but I think at the end of the day, for the most part, we're getting to this point in society, at least where there's more intelligent people showing up in situations like this. And I
Mhm.
think if you have a lot of emotional intelligence, you just know to just say nice things and be happy, and things are going to be great. And I think
Yeah.
that's a good thing that we can be striving for.
Yeah, and being compassionate individuals, we don't have to be mean about really anything. Even differing
Yeah.
of opinions is just like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. Thanks for
Yeah.
informing me. Like that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. And I think people are more willing to speak up when there's something that's like not nice.
Yeah, no, I think it's like one of my favorite things, and this is just to be a bit inside baseball. One of my favorite things on Twitter is like if somebody's like low key being not nice to somebody, like there's like a million people to like brigade in and say like, no, like stop being a dick. Like that's great to me. Like
Yeah.
I really really enjoy people getting put in their place when they deserve to be put in their place. So I feel like there's
Yeah.
a lot of times in society where people like just kind of avoid or ignore bad situations.
Pass.
On Twitter that doesn't happen because everybody has this what's the phrase? Everybody has like all of this like strength isn't the right word, but they have all this strength because it's a somewhat anonymous platform, right?
Yeah.
Like you can be very well known, but big people really don't know who you are, right? So you
Mhm.
can like build this persona and you can like no one's going to come up and like punch you in the face or like, find out where you live, hopefully, and make your day miserable. So like
Yeah.
you're allowed to defend your friends. Like
Yeah.
and you're allowed to call out people that are being unsavory, which I think is great. Um, and I love Meg's comment too. Like the open source subset of the tech community is a bit different from the tech community as a whole because many of the projects are run by volunteers. They're not for social good, and therefore social good not. And I think that definitely factors into. I think that's a really good point. Safe to say, I've met a lot of people in the open source tech community that are not cool people too. I think in general though is that you want to if you're going to be in open source, you more than likely you want to engage with people to use your thing,
Yeah.
right? Not a lot of people build some amazing tool for nobody to use it.
Yeah.
Some might build tools for themselves and realize, oh, other people might like this, which I think is great.
Yeah.
But I think the overall sentiment that if you're in tech and you're building open source tools or open source products or whatever, more than likely you have to engage with people and you have to be okay with engaging with people to some level. And you have to be open and accepting of feedback, which I think is really important. We were talking about there's lots of negative feedback, like builds don't work or
Yeah.
things, you have to deal with some weird business case or whatever, right?
Mhm.
And in open source, like the feedback can be anonymous,
Yeah.
which is a whole nother level of complexity, right?
Yeah. Which any social platform, like for example, our Slack, people can use screen names, any name they
Yeah.
want, like anything. It could be anything. But it's really
Yeah.
like people want to feel heard and then they want a compassionate answer too. Even if you don't have the answer, you can't just say go read the docs. You have to be like, yeah, let me sort this out with you or for you. One of those. And then just trying to meet them on their level because of course they could Google it, they could search it, they could search through your docs, but they just want to be heard, felt heard,
Yeah.
and kind of like taken care of. They're coming to your platform for a reason and your community chat for a reason. They just want to feel heard.
I this that's completely spot on, and I think that's even more compounded with the the addition of everything needing to be virtual, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, like there's no more water cooler conversations. There isn't as many water cooler conversations.
Yeah.
Going grabbing coffee with a friend is challenging, right? Especially like if you work for a company that doesn't have a lot of people around where you are.
Yeah.
Um, so figuring out ways to connect is like the thing. Like
Yeah.
like our brains are wired in a way that like we need this community of like, typically in thousands of years ago it was like 100 to 150 people like in our community, and that was all the people that we knew.
Yeah.
Obviously that is scaled out more. But I think
Yeah.
there's still like this huge um, motivation to like feeling connected with somebody, right? And I think that's where open source is so important. Tech open
Hmm.
source is so important. Community building is so important. So I mean, we're we have about 5 minutes left. And I want one thing that I'd like to get from you as we're wrapping up is, you know, obviously the community is something that really really interests you, right?
Yeah.
Like where do you see the opportunities to make the community even better? Like, and I know that's a very loaded question, but I'd love to get your thoughts as like somebody who's, you know, they're newish to tech, they're newish to open source, newish to community building, and you've it seems to me like you've had like a really great experience, but I imagine not every single experience has been great.
Yeah.
So I'd like to kind of know like how we can do better.
Yeah. I think as a community aspect, people, when people share what they're doing or having issues, I think the best thing we could do is be compassionate and kind of like remember that we're all humans. That's one of Harness's core values as well, as remember the human. Everyone has bad days, everyone has like rough times. Just meeting people with compassion can go a long way.
That's great.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's really interesting. I think, there's a lot of opportunity to just be better people. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what's really important. Um, yeah, I think at the end of the day, like all these things are really, really great. First off, we're wrapping up and I want to be mindful of your time. So, one of the things that we do at the end of our show is, I like to ask our guests, like, if you can think of open source or tech in general in
Mm-hmm.
one word, what would that word be for you?
Community.
Community.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. I mean, there's definitely something to just community is like what powers, at least in my opinion, open source and tech. And I think
Yeah.
that's a great answer.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, again, Marie, I want to thank you so much for tuning in and chatting with me for an hour. This has been lovely. I'm glad to hear that, a career convert was successful. And,
Yeah.
I only look forward to seeing more and more from you in the future. So
Yeah.
thank you again
Yep.
for tuning in. And for everybody else, thank you so much for tuning in and watching. This will be on demand and the podcast will be available later today. So thank you so much. Take care.